How do you get from a first draft to a finished one? Find out in this video series, continuing with theme and story structure. Hi, I'm Iris Marsh. I help indie authors with their manuscripts so they can publish with confidence. By the end of this video, you'll have learned what theme is and how to find yours, and what story structure elements there are. We're going to start with theme. So what is theme? The story theme is the takeaway message the artist wants the single audience member to discover from reading the story. It is the deeply held truth we are embedding into our story. It is the change the author is trying to evoke in the reader. So that's the definition of theme according to thestorygrid.com. And what it means essentially is that theme is what we, as writers, want our readers to take away from our story. And our theme is tied to the stakes within our chosen genre. So here again, knowing which content genre you're writing in is very important. So how do you find your theme? So of course your story can have multiple themes, but here we're really focusing on our main theme, so our global takeaway message, so to say. Your theme is based usually on both your external and internal content genre. So for instance, if you have an action story, your theme revolves around life and death. If you have a different content genre, external content genre, your theme will revolve around those stakes. So for instance, for performance, it will be revolving around success versus failure. So for an action story, a very general theme can sound like this. Life is preserved when the protagonist defeats the antagonist. Or if it's a cautionary tale, death reigns when the opposite is true, right? If your internal genre is then worldview, for instance, then you can also incorporate this into the theme. So then it becomes life is preserved when the protagonist uses their new worldview to defeat the antagonist. So here the internal and the external come together. So then you want to make the theme more specific, because the example we just gave was a very general theme and you want to make it more specific to your story. So for instance, life reigns when we learn to ask help from our friends can be the takeaway message that you want to give your readers. If your protagonist manages to defeat the antagonist and survives because they have learned to ask help of their friends. Or you can have something like life reigns when we trust in ourselves and others. So again here, that will be the theme in the case where the action external stakes will be combined with the worldview stakes, where it's very specifically the lesson that the protagonist needs to learn is to trust in themselves and in others, so people around them. In my story, the theme is life prevails when we learn true power lies in connectedness rather than control and manipulation. So here life is part of the stakes of the thriller genre, because this one goes from life to damnation. And the learn true power lies in connectedness rather than control and manipulation part is part of the worldview genre, because there's a change in the protagonist's worldview that's more complex at the end than it was in the beginning of the story, where this is the lesson that they learn and this is the lesson they apply in order to defeat the protagonist and save everyone else, or save themselves, save their friends, etc. Then we continue to structure. And these are the 5 major plot elements, or also called the 5 commandments. And these are the inciting incident. This is an unexpected event that hinders or helps the character's initial goal. So it puts the events of the story into motion and introduces the reader to the conflict. Then there's the turning point. This is a complication where the character can no longer rely on their initial strategy to reach their goal. So notice how this is also tied to certain goals that they want to achieve. The turning point leads to a crisis, which is the dilemma between two options. And the climax is the choice the character makes based on those two options. And the resolution is then the consequences of that choice that leads to the eventual value shift of the entire structure. So you can see that they're all very tied together. Now we have global structure versus acts versus sequences and versus scenes. So the structural elements that we just discussed can be found on each level of story. So they can be found in the global story, in each act, in each sequence, and in each scene. And you can even go further than that. But for this part, we'll look at the global structure. And in the next video, we'll look more closely at the structure for each act. So we're going to determine the global inciting incident. And this is conveniently determined by your content genre, because each content genre has their typical inciting incidents. We've covered this in the previous video about conventions and expectations, where one of the expectations that a reader will have within a certain content genre is this specific inciting incident. For instance, in a crime story, this will be the moment where the body is found. So that's where you'll find which type of global inciting incident you should have. So go back to your conventions and expectations and check which inciting incidents you should have. If you don't have that within your expectations, then go back to the stories you've read and compare their inciting incidents, global inciting incidents, to see what they have in common. And then you'll have your global inciting incident type. This incident knocks your protagonist's world off balance. And the global inciting incident can happen immediately. So for instance, in chapter 1, it can happen later, like in chapter 3 or 4 or sometimes even 5. Or it can happen off page, which means it happens in between chapters. Which one you choose is also dependent on your content genre. Just go back to the stories that you've studied for the conventions and expectations, see where the global inciting incident takes place, and then you'll know where the global inciting incidents will most likely come within your story. Then the global turning point. So this is the point where your protagonist can't continue on as they had. From the inciting incident on, your protagonist has had a certain strategy for dealing with obstacles or opportunities to reach their goal. So for instance, if their goal is to save a princess from a certain tower guarded by a dragon, then they will have a certain strategy set up to reach that goal. And the turning point is the moment where they can no longer hold to that strategy. So to find the global turning point, ask yourself, what's my protagonist's strategy for reaching their goal? If you don't know what their goal is, then ask yourself what their goal is first, of course. And if you find it difficult to even determine what type of goal it is, then that means that there is an issue within the structure of your story. But you should have determined the goal in our previous video, where we discussed point of view and goals. Then you can also ask which moment in my story makes reaching this goal impossible. So which moment in the story makes using this strategy for reaching this goal impossible. This moment can be an action. Someone does something that makes the strategy useless, or it can be a revelation. So new information makes the strategy useless. Then the global crisis. This is also called the mirror moment, because in some stories, this will be the moment where you can see the character kind of dramatically gazing in the mirror and they're actively questioning, who have I become? Is this the person who I want to be? So that's why it's also called this mirror moment, because it's this dilemma, and it's either an internal dilemma or an external, like the mirror moment, who have I become, or it's an external dilemma, which is most common for the external content genres. And then it'll be more revolved around either death stakes or professional stakes or romantic stakes. And if you're doing it very well, then your internal and external crisis will mesh together. So your turning point leads to a certain choice. This is a dilemma or crisis that the protagonist has to choose between. So this dilemma can consist of two equally bad choices. So the protagonist has to choose which consequence they're more willing to endure, or there are two equally good options. So the protagonist has to choose between something that's good for them or good for others, or between something they need and something they want. So the choice surrounds certain values. For your global crisis, you want that value to be related to your content genre. So for instance, you can have a choice within a certain value, which could be, for instance, the choice between safety or danger, or between arrest or revenge, which the first one is the life-death stakes values, and the second one lives within the injustice stakes values. You can also have a choice between opposing or competing values, so they're not the same values. So for instance, a choice between safety and truth, which is more a choice between an external and an internal thing. Or for instance, revenge and love. So those are then competing. And ideally, like I said, you want your global crisis to combine your external and internal genres. Then there's the global climax. And this is the moment that shows the change. So while the crisis isn't always on the page, but you kind of have to infer it often, the climax does show the change. So your protagonist makes a choice based on the crisis, and this action shows their change throughout the story. So the global climax is also dependent on your content genre, and you will find this within your conventions and expectations. For instance, for an action genre, the climax is the hero at the mercy of the villain, for instance. And their climax decision is how they defeat the villain. So climax always has to be on the page, and the protagonist has to be the one to make the decision. Then the global resolution is the moment that shows the consequences. So after your protagonist has made the choice, they need to deal with the consequences of their actions. The crisis showed what's at stake. The resolution should follow through on these stakes. So you don't want to have a climax and then have everything turn out okay and there aren't any real consequences after all, because then things will just seem very easy and convenient. When there are certain stakes to certain choices, you want to make sure you follow through on them so that they actually experience these consequences. And within the resolution, the value of the story also changes. And it answers the question that was raised from the inciting incident. So if we look at my story and the global structure, then the global elements within my story are the inciting incident. Nikki rejects a ritual to remove Loreen from her mind as she does not want her powers back. She's afraid of what Loreen might do. And as you can see, this doesn't fit with my content genre. I wanted it to be a thriller, but I actually had the inciting incident that fit with this genre in the wrong moment of the story, in the wrong timeline. So that's why it doesn't make sense. So her strategy is not to use her powers. So the turning point is the point where she can no longer use that strategy. That's when Dad, Fred, and Carter try to clear Emily's block but don't have enough power. If they fail, Emily will implode and possibly kill them. So this leads to her crisis. Does she choose safety and not use her powers so Loreen can't harm anyone, but her father and friends might die? or use her powers to help, risking Loreen to harm others and potentially orchestrate doom. And then the climax is the moment she's facing off with Loreen, and she learns to use her powers differently, so she can remove the stain of addiction from Loreen and get her back to her pre-Siphoner state. So this goes back to the theme again, is she chooses to use her power differently. And in this case, she chooses to use it as a way to connect instead of control and manipulate. And that's the learning experience that allows her to defeat Loreen. So in the resolution, they heal Emily together, so Nikki and Loreen stays within Nikki's mind. However, she's no longer a threat. If you'd like some more tips on editing, you can sign up for my free self-editing course where you'll receive some more tips on self-editing your manuscript and on the different stages of editing. You can find the link for this in the description. You can also get my developmental editing guide, which follows the same steps that I use within this video series. And you can use the description in the link and add the code YouTubeEdits for a 60% discount. For some more information on editing or some other general self-editing tips, you can also have a look at my other videos. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated for more content. In the next video, we'll dive deeper into structure, so we can evaluate your manuscript further. Thank you for watching.